Hey Marshall, how are you?
I am doing fantastic this morning. Yourself?
Doing very, very well. It's the beginning of a week, which is can be positive or negative for a lot of people. So far, it's looking up for me.
Yep.
Um, but I'm excited to talk to you. I really enjoy meeting a lot of authors who are in the various stages of their publishing journey. So tell us a little bit. How long have you been writing and publishing?
Yeah. So I am one of those eternal writers. We
Okay.
cleaned out my mom's house a few months back because she was downsizing and found some of my very early, like second grade era attempts at storytelling, which were mostly just complete plot ripoffs of Harry Potter.
Mm.
Um, but I really started seriously writing probably around 2019. I'd done, I think, two complete length novel manuscripts prior to that and had done the whole submission query trenches, gotten roundly rejected on both of them. Um, so around 2019, I decided to turn my focus to short stories instead. And since then, I've gotten about 2 dozen published with at least a dozen more to go.
Oh,
Um, and my debut novel, The Pale City, published with Shadow Alley Press. So clearly it worked out for me.
that's awesome. I don't have a lot of experience writing short stories other than, children shorts that I did for 6 or 7 months there. So I mean, when it comes to writing short stories versus full length novel, do you have a preference about which one you enjoy more, or do you just enjoy the experience overall?
I enjoy the experience overall. It's the classic analogy is it's a sprint versus a marathon. Novels take a lot of focus and concentration, which is not a bad thing, but it is a long time to spend in a single world with a single character or cast of characters. Whereas short stories, you can much more easily jump around between concepts. So I like alternating them depending on if there's a particular short story submission deadline coming up. I might take a break from novel writing to work on those. But if the novel submission deadline is coming sooner, then I'm probably more likely to focus on that. So I've just finished the rough draft of my third novel in the series and am looking forward to taking a little breather and working on some short stories coming up.
Yeah, that's awesome. So when it comes to kind of crafting the story, first of all, just out of curiosity, are you a discovery writer or do you prefer to plot your stories out?
I'm a little of both. I've learned
Okay,
that,
sure.
yeah, I definitely started as a discovery writer, but I function better, at least as far as a plot perspective, with a clear outline of, at the very least, where it's going to end up. I do this. I write my novels pretty sequentially, open chapter one and just write all the way through. But for short stories, especially, I tend to start at the end, which I think is a very useful technique to use just for writers overall, and sort of build my way back from there. Because all good stories need to take place at the last possible moment. You can't have 30 pages of the character going about their day before the inciting incident happens. So more of an architect, but I like the discoveries that happen along the way. And there's room for both within a single story. You've just got to learn how to be flexible with your draft.
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure I could write that way, but I can understand the logic behind it. Yeah,
Yeah.
obviously, everyone has their own preferences. Um, but yeah, I coincidentally have read a number of books where there's 30 pages of people going about their day before anything happens. So the question is whether or not I actually continue reading books like that, but we won't get into it. So when it comes to sucking or pulling a reader into the story, really pulling them into the world that we're creating, I want to talk a little bit about the difference, strategies for novel writing versus short stories, right? Because there's still ways to draw readers in. But when it comes to short stories, what are some of the more key elements to help you craft this world that you're building in such a short amount of time, in such a small amount of words?
Mhm. Yeah, that is a fantastic question. The first thing that comes to mind is every first line has to draw them in, which is why that's honestly kind of my go-to strategy is starting off with the most interesting or compelling first line of dialogue or scene setting or whatever I can think of that makes the reader wanting more. And that goes for my novel as well. But for short stories, given that, it is a smaller commitment of attention span, that also applies. So starting off with a strong hook in your first line, but also as far as building the world within a short story, um, less exposition, essentially. The show don't tell is one of those kind of almost cliche bits of writing advice and how much it's overused. But for short stories, especially, it really applies. You don't have to, spell things out for your reader so long as you show that the character understands how things in this world work. Trying to think of a good example.
You've got lots of different books on there
Yeah,
with
I
all of
do.
your
We
writings
can
in
cut
there.
out the pause.
No, I think that's great. Because you have a lot of experience, like you said, adding your short stories to, I'm assuming, combined works with a bunch of other authors, which I think is awesome.
Let's see. Okay, yeah. So this is a great example. This is from the collection Orpheus and Eurydice Rewoven, which is a collection of retellings of the Orpheus and Eurydice myth in various genres. Mine is called Bloodless Spirits, and it is a reimagining of the myth as a vampire story taking place in 1800s Paris.
Okay.
So, like I said, first line hook. I pretend I cannot see him. This is told from Eurydice's point of view, and rather than the serpent / Hades, we have a vampire. But more than that, I never say outright like, "Oh, this takes place in Paris during this time frame." Just the references to the different, famous landmarks, the Seine, the Arc de Triomphe, and most critically, the Parisian catacombs, all let the reader infer, where this is happening, and you have a rough idea based on just like the society of what time period. I also never even say the word vampire within it because it's not necessary. Like by context, everyone can guess, oh, this is what this is. And so just letting your reader puzzle those things out, because readers are smart, they can infer from the hints you drop through the story what is happening in this world and what this world is like. So I hope that answered that question. That was a little bit
yeah, I think that's a great example. No, awesome. And I think it probably is going to depend on the length of the story, right? I know there's a lot of different opinions about what's the difference between like a short story, and there's definitions online. But yeah, probably how much exposition exists, whether it be very little or at least a little bit to pull readers in, is probably going to depend on the word count that you're going for, or at least the story you're trying to craft. But I'm not sure that I have zero practice really doing that type of writing. I don't know that I would be interested in it, but then again, I haven't tried. Have you ever considered doing something like Kindle Vella, or are you already doing something like that where you're doing serial type episodes of literature or story?
So first off, you're absolutely right that the length definitely dictates what you can and cannot do. There's a number of different short story anthologies and publishers I submit to fairly regularly, and I've been published with the same ones multiple times, so I'm pretty comfortable with what their guideline requirements are. And yeah, depending on the length of the submission that they're seeking, that gives you a rough idea of how much story can I really fit in. Like I mentioned earlier, that you've got to fit. Sorry, there's some construction noise in the hall. It sounds like joys of living in a condo.
It's so exciting.
I know. Like I mentioned earlier, the length of the story depends on what you can fit in. And that's why I love starting at the last possible moment and hooking them into the action as late as possible. Because if I've got a story to tell in 3,000 words, I can't spend 1,000 of those, just doing set dressing. Right.
Right.
Yeah. As far as the serialized stuff, I do have a couple of my different short stories follow the same characters. So those are kind of serialized. I wouldn't say they're at the point where it's a comprehensive story. They're much more episodic. I've got, I think, 3 currently published that follow the adventures of Okabe Yukiko, who is a samurai ghost hunter in Sengoku era Japan. I've gotten 3 of those published, with a 4th one that I'm currently seeking a representation for. And maybe a novel one day down the line, because those are a lot of fun to write. And one currently published and one forthcoming that follow the adventures of Honest Oswald, who is an underworld fence in a kind of bog standard D&D fantasy setting. Basically, the concept there was, okay, how do I make a story about an NPC and go from there?
That's
So
interesting.
yeah, it's a fun, like, writing a character who survives and thrives based on, wits and guile, rather than, being a fighter or of any sort, which is obviously much more typical of the genre. So yeah,
Mhm.
there's a few that do follow. Oh, and my initial publications followed the adventures of Althea Stagg, who is a Greek demigod and detective. So that was kind of my attempt at the more classic urban fantasy uh, genre. So yeah, I've got a few that do follow the same characters, but nothing that is, I would say, serialized at this point.
At least not
Certainly
yet.
nothing. Yeah, nothing with enough that I could collect it into like one collection. Although one day
Sure.
that's kind of the goal.
Well, that's cool. That's really awesome. I've admittedly not really looked at it. I know there's a lot of authors that think it's fun to write that way. It kind of spurs their creativity. Kind of keep this these series of shorter stories in this serial way. Like I said, I've never really considered it, but I can imagine that it would add a new element to the world building component, right? Because with a short story, you have a very small amount of time to draw the reader in, help them join whatever universe you're created in such a small way. I mean, obviously, we're not getting into the massive details as with something like The Way of Kings with Brandon Sanderson, right? But when you serialize it, I can imagine there would be a different take on it, right? Because you can continue to add little bits or just build on what you've already created in that serial way. But when we're looking at novels, I mean, you've obviously published a novel. You're working on your third. I'm assuming the second one's written already.
Yes, second one comes out in January.
Yeah, perfect. That's great. When it comes to building a world there, what are some of the you would say most important elements about creating this world? I mean, it's probably not cut and dry for every novel, but at least for you as an author and what you've seen as an author, what are those key and important elements in creating that universe?
Right. So this is going to be specifically to secondary world fantasy, and it can apply more broadly to, spec fic as a whole, or even just,
Sure.
writing as a whole. Doesn't even have to be genre. This can apply to literature with a capital L as well. But
Right.
for specifically secondary world fantasy, which is my genre and what my novels are, you need to take the central question or premise of the setting and examine it thoroughly. So, The Pale City, my novel, takes place in a society where, upon death, every citizen of that society has their body transformed into a zombie servant called an attendant. And so, the central question of that world is, what does a society look like where the dead are viewed as just another resource to be exploited for the overall society? And so all of my world building springs from that central question.
Interesting. That's really interesting. So, how does that work? Do you feel like that applies to both plotters and discovery writers? Because I can see that might be a little bit difficult for perhaps a discovery writer, even if they have that question. Do you feel like, did you have your world kind of predetermined, or were there a lot of different things that sprung up as you were writing?
Both. Again, I'm
Okay,
sorry, I'm not
sure.
giving you a straight answer on that, but
Not, there is no straight answer. I
yeah.
think that's great.
So that's sort of the thing. Like, I had, from that central question, I was like, how do I make a society where the necromancers are the good guys, essentially? Because, we're so used to seeing cackling maniacs in black robes with hoods and armies with skeletons. I wanted to turn that on its head and say, how do we make a society where this is not only not taboo, but is so accepted at the everyday level that people hardly think about the fact that, there are dead people doing all of their labor. So that's the central question that was constantly in my mind as I was figuring out the plot. And the plot was about equal parts. I had the rough layout, but there were definitely some discovery portions in the middle. The first book, anyway, I did write a little bit out of order. But there's room for both, I think, because I knew that I wanted the zombies to be, as sort of essentially flesh robots. Like they don't really have any true sentience or awareness, but they can follow orders. And I knew I wanted them to be used for soldiers as well, but I had to kind of instill an Asimov style 3 laws where they can't harm the living unless expressly directed to by somebody with the authority to do that. And it's things like that where, as I'm writing, I'm discovering the consequences of like this central world building question that I've set up. What happens when someone tells a zombie to kill somebody? Like, can they do it? Or I've got to put something in there where they're not allowed to unless it's somebody authorized to do it, and things like that. It's or someone brought up to me recently while reading the book, actually, what do they do about the smell? And I'm like, great question. That is actually in there as a throwaway line, that they use a ton of incense to make the city not smell like death all the time. So it's little things like that where you've got the question in your mind as you're writing, and as these things crop up, you have the discovery of this is the answer to these smaller questions that come along, and each of those questions that's answered really helps flesh out the world.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. And I know that I've kind of answered a lot of questions like that as I'm writing, and it does I'm not a plotter. I'm a pretty hardcore discovery writer. I don't really pre-plan anything. But yeah, there's a lot of those little questions, like kind of how would X character react, or what would be the reality of the situation if X was true? And some of the questions are easier to answer than others, but yeah, answering those questions for yourself helps you to have the characters respond in certain ways, and probably put, like you said, those throwaway lines or small lines in there or whatnot about answering the question that the readers might have. But I think the thing to keep in mind is it's not always bad to have questions unanswered, right? And I think that it's kind of a fine line to deal with, though, right? Because there's a difference between a world that's very not well thought out, and there's just too many questions, and by the reader's just getting flubbed up one by one, and by the time they've reached 50% through the book, they're like, I'm just confused, I don't understand this world, nothing makes sense. Versus, oh, I wonder what X would be like. There's no specific answer. Well, I'm going to assume, or this is how I would answer the question. Kind of gives a little bit of flexibility to the reader to imagine. I've read some books where the world is a little too thought out and there's too much explanation. I'm just like, there's not a lot left to my imagination. As a reader, I like to imagine, I like to answer questions in my mind, be like, oh, I bet this, or I bet X, right? But it's just a really challenging place to find yourself, right? Because you don't want to answer too many questions, and you don't want to leave too many questions open. So how did you feel comfortable with The Pale City and your short stories, that you've answered the right amount of questions? Or how can an author feel comfortable with that?
Absolutely. So the classic example of that tension there is the great master of the genre, of course, Tolkien. Middle Earth is famously, the most well-realized and enriching and captivating fantasy world out there, which is why we're still talking about it 70 years later. But reading the original trilogy, it is full of these oblique references to Feanor and the Silmarils and all these things that, in 1956, when the book comes out, no one has any idea what he's talking about. And it's not until the Silmarillion comes out later that, we get the actual explanation. But Tolkien had all of these backstory thoughts in his mind already answered. So that's kind of, I think, the answer to, how much explaining is too much explaining. Don't do that. If he'd included all of that text in the original trilogy, it never would have been published. And it's the doorstopper as it is. But the fact that the author knows in his mind what the answers to a lot of these questions are helps the verisimilitude, because then you can do what he did and just drop these references to the pre-established world mythology in there, and that helps make it feel like a lived-in world. So back to my own story. I'm proud of this because this is actually something one of my reviewers said, is that the exposition never bogs down the plot, and the reader is left to figure out enough of the way the world and society works without having to, stop to explain every 5 seconds. I'm never going to be like, this is how you make a zombie step by step. I just kind of give a throwaway, like, yeah, and then there's some like magic alchemy involved, and that keeps it from, rotting all the time. And that's kind of the answer. The less time you spend slowing down the plot, because the plot and the characters are what we're really in the story for. Like, I love world building, and I'm of the opinion that all writers approach a story from either a plot, character, or world building perspective. And for me, I honestly definitely approach this one from a world building perspective. But at the same time, if it's just the world building that you're mostly invested in, you might as well just write an atlas or an encyclopedia.
Right.
So since the world building has to be in service to the plot, which has to be in service to the character and their journey, that's kind of the hierarchy of storytelling devices, in my opinion.
Yeah, you're right. And there's just kind of a balance of all things. It all has to work together. And I know that there's some people that are, they don't actually get to the writing part, right?
Mhm.
Because they're just too busy getting into these crazy details and spreadsheets and Word docs and whatnot. And they're just going into so many details of the world, which I think is amazing. And they love that piece of it. But at that point, I'm just like, maybe you should be, drawing a picture, or, this sounds a little bit less like a novel and more like some other type of entertainment. It just, get into the writing piece is really important, because you can't can't weave that world into everything else that's important, which is the character work. Reading books that are all world building and very little character work are hard to read, right? Like I
Yeah.
just don't find myself caring about what the, what the book is actually about, because it's not about anything. And vice versa, if it's all character work and very little world building at the same time, like, well, this is a fun, entertaining read, but admittedly, I probably won't remember what
Right.
happens because I'm
Exactly.
not brought into this world. So yeah, it's an interesting balance to have to learn. And the only way to do it is to write, right? To
Right.
gain
Exactly.
experience and to learn.
The yeah, the key thing is always the button chair, hands on keyboard, right? Like, so if you're not writing it, then you're not writing it. Like, you can have all the ideas you want, but they've got to go someplace if you're really trying to make a serious effort at putting it out there for other people's consumption. If you're not, there's nothing wrong with that. It's
Right.
fine to come up with, your own fantasy world in your head and,
Absolutely.
daydream it and come up with it. But if your goal is to get it published for somebody else, eventually it's got to get out of your head and onto the computer or
Right. Exactly.
longhand or however you prefer to write.
I know a lot of people that create just for their own entertainment. I see them don't frown on that at all. I think it's amazing. But if your
Yeah,
goal is to
absolutely.
get some type of output, you need to work towards that output. Otherwise, it's not going to work out. So, are there any pitfalls that you can think about when it comes to world building? Whatever they could be, anything that you've seen, or possibly mistakes you've made yourself or seen other people make when it comes to world building.
Continuity is a big one, because it's great to have these
Yeah,
ideas, but you've got to make sure you are referencing them back and you're not contradicting yourself. That
sure.
without giving remotely any spoilers or anything away, that was a plot complication in the first draft of the second book in my trilogy, where I got the manuscript back from the beta reader from my publisher, and they were like, "This completely contradicts the way you said the magic system worked earlier." So I had to,
Oh,
obviously, the first book is finished at this point, so it's not like I'm going to undo that. And anyway, the reader was correct in their estimation of why this didn't work. But then I had to go through the manuscript I'd given them and rephrase things and just do some finagling to make sure it's still in line with what I've already established as canon to this world.
that
So
is a really challenging one, particularly for discovery writers. Now, I know it's hard for plotters too,
yeah.
because continuity. You're writing a lot of words,
Mhm.
and it's sometimes difficult to remember what X character is like, or what the world is like, the rules of engagement, and the laws of the land and whatnot. So yeah, it's tricky. Notes, right?
Yeah, exactly. I'm
Right.
like I
Take
said,
good
I've
notes.
just finished. Yeah, the notes are your friend. Like I said, I just finished the first draft of the manuscript for the third book last week, and I'm going back through it right now before I submit it to my publisher to be more closely examined. And like, literally, like in the first two chapters, one of the characters casually dropped something that I had forgotten they had dropped and put in as a reveal during the epilogue. And I'm like, all right, well, I've got to adjust one of these.
Mm, so what did you decide? I'm curious.
Oh,
Curiosity.
editing out of the epilogue, because
Oh,
honestly,
okay.
it's a good character note, and it's really just okay. This isn't a surprise after all.
Oh, fair
Um,
enough. Yeah,
yeah,
there are some
exactly.
of those.
Yeah,
Um,
the plot isn't so far. I'm only like 100 pages out of my 400 into the review and edit stage, but so far I haven't majorly contradicted myself yet. So fingers crossed that it stays smooth.
that's good. Having an objective view on it as well is helpful, whether it be your eyes after taking a break for a few months, or beta readers, other eyes on it. It's just very helpful to find that continuity.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I can see how that would be pretty challenging pitfall for readers. So I guess for just out of curiosity, from your opinion standpoint, what is your favorite part of the world building process? What do you enjoy so much about it?
Definitely it is the discovery segment of it.
Sure.
Just the fact that I can, from that central story question, how does that impact everything? What kind of world are you building as you go along? The Pale City, the society that it takes place in, has sort of a very Roman Republic-esque trappings. Their names are all sort of classically Latin sounding. And that originated from the fact that, if I'm going to build a society where necromancy is the norm and, they are exploiting the bodies of the dead for their own economic gain, there's got to be something redeeming about that society, right? So I thought about, if the common people don't have to work for a living, or at least they don't have to work in like the unskilled menial labor jobs that constituted so much of pre-industrial society, what do they do now? Does that free them up to take on more skilled labor? And how does that advance them as a society? So from, again, these questions that are spiraling out of the central question, the answers rise to, okay, I have to make the society morally defensible in somehow. So despite this being, a fantasy setting, it's not going to be, feudalism and kings. This is a republic. They're a democratic society, and that goes a long way towards morally justifying, or allegedly morally justifying, their exploitation of the dead as cheap labor.
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
I find the idea fascinating, but just kind of the layered way of approaching it, I can see how that would be really, really enjoyable. I prefer the discovery writing piece of it. That's why I'm a discovery writer. I mean, I enjoy not really knowing. I mean, I know some things, I mostly know where characters are going to end, and I more often than not know the ending of the book. But just kind of seeing what happens is the exciting. But for me, it's like reading the book for the first time. Which I really like. You kind of surprise yourself as well with some of the world. There are some things that happen in the worlds of the Lightbearer Chronicles that I didn't really expect. It's like, all right, we'll go with it, right? It just becomes a whole new exciting piece of the world. And I've had a number of people say, like, I just really like this aspect of the world building, which I appreciate, and that it all connected throughout the series. So what's the intention for the length of the series for the Pale series? I'm not sure what's the name of this series for the Pale City.
Yeah, the series overall is called the Rites of Resurrection.
Okay.
The Rites, Rites, is the name of the magic system. They're using rites essentially because the whole zombie resurrecting and control is based on a religious ritual from the main character's minority religion. Like sure. I said, there's a lot of world building involved here. The Rites of Resurrection trilogy is 3 books. Third one is in late first draft stage. The second one is called the Ashen City. So there's a theme name going on. I don't think I can reveal the third book title yet, but it will also be the Adjective City. And the second one, the Ashen City, comes out in January. The first one, the Pale City, is already out now on Kindle Unlimited and paperback, which will be the format release for all 3 of them. There will be an audio version at some point. We were hoping to do a simultaneous audio release, but things just didn't line up with the narrator we had in mind. So we're going to put that out a little bit later, hopefully before too long. And after 3 books, I think that I don't know, there might be a future for this world, but it won't be following the same main character and the same very contained plot, because they all take place within the city itself. Mm-hmm. If I do write further in this world, it'll be either with a different main character or in a different location. Because reason being that, like I said, setting starts with the central question: what is a society where the dead are just another source of labor to be exploited look like? And by the end of the 3rd book in the series, that question, I think, has been thoroughly answered.
Awesome. I think that's great. I mean, the great thing about being authors and crafting these worlds is you can do with them what you want. I mean, you could do something like Brandon Sanderson, right, where it's this entire this massive world that's connected with various different things, or you could just, I'm intending on kind of staying within the world of the Library Chronicles and writing a series kind of like 50, 100 years later, right?
Yeah.
Like, let's look at what happens as a result of this series. It obviously wraps up the storyline, but there's things intentionally left open with the intention of writing more. I think that's really great, right? You're crafting this place, which hopefully your readers are loving so much that they want more, even when the story is completed. They're like, well, I don't want to leave this world. The characters you can kind of say goodbye to, but sometimes you just want more from the world. And creating a place where you and your readers can just enjoy being in. I think that's kind of the goal, or perhaps dislike. I mean, there are worlds that I would not want to live in, but that's good. I'm still intrigued and fascinated by them, but I would never want to live in them. So it's just the craft around it is just really exciting and fun. So if you have any advice for authors who are diving into reading or want to get into, writing, or want to begin writing, where would you advise someone begin when it comes to building a world?
So I think that the central story question of your world is something to consider, definitely, because on the one hand, there is, you want it to be yours, right? Right. All writing is an expression of what we've got inside ourselves, and due to our different backgrounds and experiences, we're all going to have a different cocktail of emotional foundations to build off of. So whatever you write is going to be uniquely you. What you need to consider in a world building aspect of that is, what am I trying to create with this world? Mine is a lot of socio and political stuff disguised in a fun fantasy murder mystery. Questions about the use of labor and the tension inherent in a society between your societal obligations to your country and to your religion in places where those might conflict. That's a very big central question of the main character, and that comes from my background and things that I have dealt with in my life. So it's going to be the same for you. Whatever it is that you write as a writer, you're going to bring your own experiences to the table. What you need to identify is, what is it specifically of myself that I am pouring into this world, and where is the conflict there, and what answer am I trying to arrive at? And you don't have to have an answer for that last part. If there should be a central conflict inherent in the story that you're telling, and probably in the world that it takes place in as well, and you don't have to know the answer, right? I think for my main character, the whole nation versus religion conflict is answered ultimately, but I don't know that it has a one-to-one translation into real life, because he is not in the same position as people in the real world are in regards to that. So it's you bring the universality of a conflict by bringing specificity of your own experience. And that goes for whatever it is you write, whatever kind of world you write. What does that look like? I hope that answers the question. That got a little meandering.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. I think, I think a lot of people don't know where to begin, but I think that's a really succinct way to describe the beginning stages of building this world. And then a lot of it'll come later. I think there's too much worry around getting everything perfect right off the bat. So
yes, absolutely. You do not need to have all the answers. I had a friend who just started reading it text me, and she was like, I finished the first chapter. I really wish there was a map. And I'm like, that would be cool. I'm not a map maker or a geographer, and I do not want to get myself bogged down in, the minutia of that aspect of the world building. So I have a vague idea in my head of where all the neighboring countries are in relation to this central location, but there's no map, and you don't have to have one.
No, you don't have to. Some people prefer it. Some people don't. Some people have the skills or the resources to make them, and it's totally fine if you don't. But that's just one part of the world building. But
right. The important thing there, I think, to clarify for the listener, is that coherency is going to trump detail every time. What matter, you don't have to have every corner of your world figured out. What matters is the corners that your character and your story interact with and touch on are fleshed out enough that you can believe it, and that there's not going to be any wait, if they're all living on the back of a giant sea turtle floating in the ocean, how do they eat? Just to like pluck a very random example.
That is a very interesting example. Really curious to know where that was drawn from. But no, it's a good
Know,
question.
Discworld, maybe.
That, but I think that's great. So we're running out of time, and I always love to ask the author before we close up, where can people find more information about you and your books if they want to check it out?
Absolutely. So The Pale City, my debut novel, is out on Amazon on Kindle Unlimited and paperback. Go there, search The Pale City, Pale, pale like, lost color in your face, not like a bucket. I'm Marshall J. Moore. That is all of my author handles under that. You can find me on TikTok under Marshall J. Moore Author, all one word. I do a lot of writing advice, and I read a lot, so there's a good bit of book reviews on there as well. So if you're in anything in the fantasy, sci-fi, horror spaces, I've probably read something that you're going to like. You can find me on Twitter under capital KWAJ14. Couldn't fit Marshall J. Moore Author on that. I believe I'm under the Marshall J. Moore Author at Instagram as well. And you can find me on Facebook on my author page, which is facebook.com/KWAJ Marshall.
Perfect.
Yeah.
That's
so
awesome.
Those
And we'll
are,
have all this in
my
the show notes. So
yes, absolutely. And also my webpage, because I got that set up a few months ago and I keep forgetting it exists. That is also marshalljmoore.com.
Perfect. That's great. Yeah, any of the links will be in the show notes for anybody listening. So you can take a look at that and find the books. So thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. This has been a ton of fun. Really appreciate you reaching out, and looking forward to listening to this.
Yeah, it'll be great.